His heart froze. His triplets were laughing on the floor with the woman he paid to be invisible. Caleb Whitmore came home early that day, his grief like a second skin he couldn't shed. The last thing he expected in his silent mansion was the sound of children laughing, especially when those children were his sons, who hadn't made a joyful sound in nearly a year. His heart stopped. Eli, Jonah, and Lucas hadn't laughed since their mother died. Not once. Not through birthdays, holidays, or the parade of specialists he'd hired to fix them. They'd become small, hollow versions of themselves, moving through the Connecticut mansion like ghosts haunting their own lives. But right now, they were laughing. Caleb stood frozen in his own foyer, chasing the sound like a man who'd just heard the dead speak. His briefcase slipped from his fingers. He moved through the house, following that impossible joy down the hallway toward the living room, the room Rebecca had decorated with so much hope before the triplets were born. When he pushed open the door, what he saw shattered every wall he'd built around his heart. The day had been merciless. Caleb Whitmore had sat through back-to-back meetings in his Manhattan office that felt like emotional warfare. A property deal in Tribeca falling apart. Investors threatening to pull funding from his largest commercial project. His CFO questioning decisions that had always been his strength. By 3 o'clock, rage and exhaustion had fused into something toxic in his chest. He'd left without explanation, waving off his assistant's concerns, and drove north toward Greenwich with his hands strangling the steering wheel. The whole drive, his mind was at war. Anger at the board, fury at business partners who'd lost their nerve. But underneath it all, deeper and more corrosive, was the rage he couldn't voice. Rage at God for taking Rebecca, for leaving him with 3 infant sons he didn't know how to reach, for making him a father who watched his children fade into silence while he threw money at problems that didn't care about his billions. When he pulled through the iron gates of his estate, he felt nothing. Just the familiar weight of returning to a house that had become a mausoleum. He walked through the front door, loosening his tie, expecting what always waited for him. Silence. The kind that reminded him every single day that his wife was gone and his boys had stopped being children. The kind that made him wonder if joy could die in a place, leaving only the architecture behind. But today, something was different. He heard laughter, real, uncontrollable, soul-deep laughter that made his breath catch in his throat. Benjamin froze, his sons, Eli, Jonah, and Lucas, laughing. They hadn't laughed in 11 months, not since that October night when Rebecca's blood pressure spiked during delivery and the doctors couldn't save her. Not since the triplets came home to a house without their mother's heartbeat. They'd become unreachable, too traumatized to play, too lost to remember what happiness felt like. Every therapist said the same thing: early trauma, attachment disruption, wait and see. But right now, right this second, they were laughing. Caleb's chest tightened so hard it hurt. He moved through the house in a daze, his expensive shoes silent on marble floors Rebecca had chosen, down the hallway, past family photos that felt like accusations, toward the living room where the sound was coming from, that beautiful, impossible sound. He pushed the door open, and everything stopped. Lydia Brooks, the woman the agency had sent a month ago to keep the house running, was on her hands and knees on the Persian rug. His 3 sons, his precious broken boys, were on her back, their faces lit with joy he thought had been buried with their mother. Lucas held a rope loosely around her waist like reins. Lydia was neighing like a horse, tossing her head, laughing with them like the weight of the world didn't exist. Caleb couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His sons, the ones who woke up screaming, who wouldn't let anyone touch them, who asked in whispers where Mommy went, were playing, actually playing. Their laughter filled the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. And it wasn't with him. It was with her. A woman he'd barely noticed. A maid he'd hired to clean and cook and stay invisible. She'd done what he couldn't do, what all his wealth and desperation and fury at God couldn't accomplish. She'd brought them back to life. The anger from his day dissolved into something far more devastating, relief so sharp it felt like a blade, shame that burned in his throat, gratitude so painful it threatened to crack him open right there in the doorway. Then Lydia looked up. Her eyes met his. The laughter died instantly. Fear flashed across her face, the kind of fear that comes from crossing invisible lines. She froze, still on her hands and knees. The boys went quiet. They slid off her back and pressed close to her sides, small hands gripping her blue uniform like they were protecting something precious. Caleb stood there, unable to speak. His throat was too tight. His vision blurred at the edges. Lydia opened her mouth, searching for words that wouldn't come. He should have said something, should have done something. But all he could do was stare at this woman who'd just given his sons back their souls, who'd done what every degree and credential and expensive intervention had failed to do. He managed a small nod. Then he turned and walked away before the tears came. He didn't understand what had just happened. Didn't know if it was right to feel this grateful to someone who was supposed to be just staff. Didn't know what it meant that his sons had come alive for her when they'd stayed hollow for him. But one thing was undeniable. For the first time since Rebecca died, his sons were laughing. And maybe, just maybe, God had sent Lydia Brooks for a reason he was finally ready to see. Before we begin, subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Sometimes God places people in our lives exactly when we need them most. The sound of their laughter followed Caleb down the hall and into his study, where he closed the door and let himself break. And as he sat there, head in his hands, he couldn't stop his mind from returning to the day it all began. The day everything ended, the day Rebecca died and took the light from his house, his sons, and his faith with her. But that was then. Now, something was changing. Over the next 3 weeks, Caleb watched his house come back to life in ways that defied everything he understood about grief and healing. It started small. Lydia didn't follow the careful schedules the previous nannies had created. She didn't use behavioral charts or reward systems, or any of the clinical approaches the child psychologists had recommended. Instead, she did something far more radical. She played. Every morning before breakfast, she'd gather the boys on the kitchen floor and let them help her make pancakes, even when they made catastrophic messes. She sang while she worked, old hymns Caleb half remembered from a childhood he'd left behind. Her voice was soft but steady, filling the spaces where silence had lived too long. And she prayed. Not quietly, not hidden. She prayed over meals like it was the most natural thing in the world, holding the boys' small hands in hers, thanking God for food and laughter and second chances. The first time Caleb witnessed it, standing unnoticed in the doorway, something twisted painfully in his chest. The boys responded to her like flowers turning towards sunlight. Eli, the most withdrawn of the three, started seeking her out when he woke from nightmares. Jonah, who hadn't spoken more than whispers in months, began narrating his play in full sentences when Lydia was near. Lucas, the one who'd stopped making eye contact with anyone, would climb into her lap with a book and wait, patient and trusting, for her to read. They slept better. The house stopped echoing with their screams at 3 a.m. They smiled. They reached for touch instead of flinching from it, and Caleb watched it all from a distance, unsettled and grateful in equal measure. He started coming home early, not to intervene, not to supervise, just to observe. He'd sit in his study with the door cracked open, pretending to work while listening to Lydia's voice drift through the house, listening to his son's laugh, listening to the sound of a home that was learning to breathe again. But the gratitude was complicated by something darker, guilt. Every time he saw his sons light up at Lydia's presence, he felt the weight of his failure press harder against his ribs. He was their father. He should have been the one to reach them. He should have been the one they ran to. He should have known how to pull them out of the darkness. But he hadn't. She had. It wasn't romantic jealousy. It was something far more primal. Spiritual, maybe. She'd reached his sons in places he couldn't access, touched wounds he couldn't heal. She'd succeeded where he'd catastrophically failed, and every burst of their laughter was both a gift and an accusation. One evening, 3 weeks after that first day, Caleb was working late in his study when he heard something unexpected. Crying. Not the boys, someone else. He moved quietly through the darkened house, following the sound to the kitchen. Through the doorway, he could see Lydia sitting at the small table where the staff took their meals, her shoulders shaking. In her hands was a silver necklace, delicate and worn. She held it like it was made of grief itself. Caleb hesitated. This felt private, sacred even. He should leave, but he didn't. He cleared his throat softly. Lydia's head snapped up, tears streaming down her face. She moved to wipe them away, to compose herself, but Caleb raised a hand. "Don't," he said quietly. "Please." They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Lydia looked down at the necklace in her palm. "His name was Daniel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He would have been 12 this month." Caleb felt the air leave his lungs. He had leukemia. We fought it for 3 years. 3 years of hospitals and treatments and prayers that felt like they were hitting a ceiling. She traced the necklace with her thumb. "He died in my arms on a Tuesday morning. The doctors said there was nothing more they could do, so I held him and sang to him until he stopped breathing." Caleb's throat closed. He didn't trust himself to speak. "I didn't think I'd survive it," Lydia continued. "For months I didn't want to. But my faith—" She paused, struggling. "My faith was the only thing that kept me from disappearing completely. I had to believe God hadn't abandoned me, that Daniel's life meant something, that my pain had purpose." "How?" The word came out rough, almost angry. "How do you believe that?" Lydia looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw his own brokenness reflected in her eyes. "Because I have to believe God sends broken people to broken places on purpose," she said. "That grief doesn't disqualify us from His work. It qualifies us. We know what loss feels like. We know what hope costs. We know how to sit with pain without trying to fix it too fast." Caleb shook his head. "Grief doesn't transform. It destroys." "It does both," Lydia said softly. "It destroys who you were. But if you let it, if you don't run from it or bury it or try to buy your way out of it, it transforms you into someone who can hold other people's pain without flinching. Someone. Who knows resurrection isn't about erasing death. It's about learning to live anyway." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. He'd spent 11 months trying to erase Rebecca's death, trying to fix his sons so he wouldn't have to feel the loss, trying to control everything, because control was the only thing that kept the grief from swallowing him whole. But Lydia hadn't tried to fix his sons. She'd loved them, through the brokenness, through the trauma, through the mess. "Your boys don't need fixing, Mr. Whitmore," Lydia said gently. "They need someone to show them it's safe to feel again, to laugh again, to trust that joy won't be taken away the second they reach for it." Something cracked open in Caleb's chest, not healing, not yet, but the first fracture in the bitterness he'd been carrying like armor. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Really?" Lydia smiled. sad and knowing, because God answers prayers we're too broken to speak. You prayed for your sons, even if you didn't use words, even if you were angry, and I prayed to matter again, to love again without it destroying me. She looked toward the stairs where the boys slept peacefully. I think he heard both of us. Caleb sat in the kitchen long after Lydia went to her room. He stared at nothing, thought about everything. And for the first time since Rebecca died, he understood something that had eluded him. Lydia hadn't come to clean his house. She'd come to resurrect it. The whispers started in the kitchen. Caleb didn't hear them at first. He was too busy noticing how his sons had transformed, how they ran through the house now with the kind of wildness healthy children possessed. But his housekeeper, Margaret, had been with the family for 15 years. She noticed everything. "It's not appropriate," Margaret muttered to the groundskeeper one morning, her voice carrying through the service hallway. "The way those boys cling to her, the way Mr. Whitmore looks at her. People will talk." "People are already talking," the groundskeeper replied. They were right. At the country club, over tennis matches and martini lunches, Greenwich society had found its newest source of entertainment. Caleb heard fragments of it when he attended a charity gala he couldn't avoid. Conversations that died when he approached, glances that lasted too long. Patricia Carmichael, an old friend of Rebecca's, cornered him by the bar with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Caleb, darling, we've all been so worried about you," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Raising those boys alone must be impossible. I heard you've brought someone in to help. From an agency?" "I have staff, Patricia. I've always had staff." "Of course. But this one seems quite involved. The boys call her by her first name, I'm told. She takes them to the park, holds their hands at church." Patricia's smile sharpened. "It's just that boundaries are so important, especially with help. You wouldn't want people getting the wrong impression." "And what impression would that be?" Patricia's eyes flicked to a group of women watching from across the room. "That you're confused about who belongs where in your household. That grief has clouded your judgment. That those boys are being raised by someone who doesn't understand their world." The words landed exactly as intended. 2 days later, Caleb received a call from Greenwich Academy, the prestigious private school where he'd submitted applications for the Triplets. The admissions director's voice was polite but final. "Mr. Whitmore, after careful consideration, we've decided the boys would be better served elsewhere. Their recent behavioral history, combined with concerns about their current home environment, suggests they need a more structured setting than we can provide." "What concerns about their home environment?" A pause. "We're simply looking out for the children's best interests." They'd rejected his sons because of gossip, because Lydia loved them too openly, because she didn't know her place. Caleb hung up and put his fist through the wall of his study, but the person who felt it most was Lydia herself. She overheard the staff whispering. She saw the looks when she took the boys into town. She noticed how other nannies at the park pulled their charges away when she approached, like proximity to her might contaminate them. She understood what was happening. Her presence was becoming a problem, not for the boys, not for their healing, but for their future, for the life Caleb's wealth and position could provide, for the doors that should be opened to them. She knew what she had to do. On a Thursday evening, while the boys played in the bath under Margaret's supervision, Lydia went to her room and pulled her suitcase from the closet. She moved quietly, methodically, folding her few belongings with hands that trembled. She'd call the agency in the morning, tell them she needed to be reassigned, disappear before she caused more damage. She was folding her last shirt when she heard footsteps in the doorway. "What are you doing?" Caleb's voice was low, dangerous. Lydia turned to find him staring at her suitcase like it was a betrayal. I'm leaving, Mr. Whitmore. Why? Because I'm hurting them, she said simply. I'm hurting your sons. The school rejection, the whispers, the way people look at them now. I thought I was helping, but I'm making their lives harder. That's not true. It is true, Lydia said, her voice breaking. I'm not their mother. I'm not family. I'm staff who forgot where the lines were. And now they're paying for my mistake, for my selfishness. I wanted to love them so badly that I didn't think about what it would cost. Caleb moved into the room, his hands clenched at his sides. You're leaving because of gossip? Because small-minded people can't understand what you've done for us? I'm leaving because love sometimes means protecting them from yourself, Lydia said. I know what it's like to lose everything, Mr. Whitmore. I won't be the reason your sons lose their future, their opportunities, their place in the world. Their place, Caleb's voice rose. Their place is happy. Their place is alive. Their place is with someone who loves them enough to get on her hands and knees and pretend to be a horse. You think I care about Greenwich Academy? You think I care what Patricia Carmichael says at the country club? You should care. They're your sons. And you brought them back to life. The words exploded out of him. You did what I couldn't do. What all my money and power and connections couldn't do. You made them. Laugh again. You made them whole again. And you think I'm going to let you walk away because people are uncomfortable? Tears streamed down Lydia's face. I'm not their mother. No, Caleb said, his voice breaking. You're not. But you're the only reason they're still here. The only reason I'm still here. He sank down onto the edge of her bed, head in his hands, and for the first time in 11 months, Caleb Whitmore prayed aloud. God, he said, his voice raw and shaking. I don't understand you. I don't understand why you took Rebecca, why you let my sons suffer, why you made me watch them disappear into grief I couldn't reach. He looked up at Lydia. But I know you sent her. I don't know how I know, but I do. And if you brought her here to save us, then I'm begging you, don't let her go. Don't take another miracle away from us. Lydia's breath caught. She'd never heard him pray, never heard him speak to God as anything other than an enemy. Stay, Caleb said, looking at her now. Not as staff, not as someone who has to hide in the kitchen or pretend she's invisible. Stay as family. Stay as the person my sons run to, the person who made them believe in joy again. Stay as the woman who saved us all. Mr. Whitmore. Caleb, he corrected. If you stay, you call me Caleb. Lydia wiped her eyes, her heart at war with itself. If I stay, I won't hide anymore. I won't pretend to be less than I am to make other people comfortable. If I stay in the light, with them, with you, as family. Caleb nodded, something fierce and protective blazing in his eyes. Then let them talk, he said. Let them whisper and judge and close their doors. I've built an empire. I can build my sons a better world than the one that rejected them. A world where love matters more than position, where the woman who saved their lives is honored, not hidden. Lydia stared at him for a long moment. Then she unpacked her suitcase. And Caleb Whitmore chose truth over reputation, knowing it would cost him everything and give him the only thing that mattered. The backlash came swiftly. Within a week of Lydia staying, 3 families canceled business dinners with Caleb. His mother-in-law stopped returning his calls. 2 board members suggested, delicately, that his personal choices were affecting investor confidence. Patricia Carmichael sent a handwritten note expressing her deep concern for the boy's well-being and offering to connect him with more appropriate childcare services. Caleb threw the note in the fireplace and watched it burn. He'd spent his entire adult life building an empire on other people's approval, chasing their investment dollars, seeking their validation, playing by rules designed to keep people like Lydia invisible and people like him powerful. He was done. The first public stand came at church, the same church Rebecca had loved, where Caleb had stopped attending after her funeral because he couldn't stand the platitudes about God's plan. But Lydia had been taking the boys on Sunday mornings, and one weekend, Caleb decided to join them. They walked in together, Caleb, Lydia, and the triplets, not separately, not with Lydia trailing behind like staff, together, like a family. The sanctuary went quiet. Caleb felt every eye on them as they moved down the aisle. He heard the whispers, saw the shock on faces he'd known for years. But he also saw his sons holding Lydia's hands, completely at peace, and he knew he'd made the right choice. They sat in the fourth row. Eli climbed into Lydia's lap during the sermon. Jonah leaned against Caleb's shoulder. Lucas fell asleep with his head on Lydia's arm. And when the pastor asked the congregation to greet one another, Caleb introduced Lydia not as his employee, but as family. "This is Lydia Brooks," he said to a stunned couple in the pew behind them. "She's the reason my sons are alive again, the reason we're here at all." Some people turned away. Others offered tight smiles and said nothing. But a few, the ones who'd known real loss themselves, nodded with understanding. One older woman squeezed Lydia's hand and whispered, "God bless you, dear." After that, Caleb stopped hiding. He brought Lydia to parent meetings at the new school he'd enrolled the boys in, a progressive academy that valued character over pedigree. He introduced her to his business partners not as staff, but as an essential part of his family. When people asked questions, he answered them honestly. "Lydia saved my sons when I couldn't. She loved them back to life. If that makes you uncomfortable, that's something you'll need to reconcile with God, not me." Some relationships ended. Invitations stopped coming. Old friends became distant acquaintances. But Caleb discovered something remarkable in the wreckage. He didn't miss them. The people who mattered, the ones whose love wasn't conditional on his conformity, stayed. And the space left by those who departed filled with something better. Freedom, authenticity, peace. The transformation in the house was undeniable. The triplets thrived in ways that seemed almost miraculous. Eli, once so withdrawn he'd barely speak, now narrated everything with enthusiasm. Jonah discovered a love for music and would sing the hymns Lydia taught him at the top of his lungs. Lucas, the most traumatized of the three, had stopped having nightmares entirely. He slept through the night, woke with smiles, and sought out affection with the confidence of a child who knew he was loved. They played, they laughed, they fought and made up and acted like normal, healthy, gloriously alive children. The house itself changed. It was no longer a museum of grief. Rebecca's memory lived there still, honored. In photos and stories Lydia encouraged the boys to share, but it was no longer a shrine. The mansion breathed again. Windows stayed open. Music played. The kitchen smelled like fresh bread and pancakes, and the kind of chaos that comes from children who feel safe enough to make messes. Lydia was no longer the maid. She was the heartbeat of the home. She managed the household, yes, but she also made decisions about the boys' education, their activities, their spiritual development. She prayed with them every night. She disciplined them when they needed it. She celebrated their victories and comforted their fears. She was, in every way that mattered, their mother. And Caleb watched it all with a gratitude that brought him to his knees. One evening, 6 months after that first day he'd come home and heard laughter, Caleb stood in the doorway of the living room and witnessed something that finally made sense of everything. Lydia was on the floor, papers spread around her as she helped Lucas with a school project. Eli was reading aloud from a book while sitting on the couch, his voice confident and clear. Jonah was building something elaborate with blocks, humming one of Lydia's hymns. It was ordinary. Beautifully, perfectly ordinary. And Caleb understood. The shock that day hadn't been seeing his sons on Lydia's back, laughing. The shock had been witnessing what God could rebuild from ashes, what he could resurrect from grief, what he could create when Caleb finally stopped trying to control everything and let grace do its work. God hadn't ignored his prayers. He'd answered them in a woman with a blue uniform and a broken heart and a faith that refused to die. He'd answered them in a love that showed up in an apron and got on hands and knees and made horse sounds until children remembered how to be children again. "What are you thinking about?" Lydia asked, looking up and catching him watching. Caleb smiled, his throat tight. "How wrong I was about everything." "Wrong how?" "I thought grief was the end of the story," he said. "I thought when Rebecca died, joy died with her. That faith was for people who hadn't been betrayed by life. That family was only blood and legal documents." Lydia stood, brushing off her jeans. "And now?" "Now I know that love doesn't erase grief. It gives it purpose." He looked at his sons, thriving and whole. And faith doesn't arrive perfectly. It arrives faithfully. Sometimes in ways we never expected. In people we almost missed because we were looking for the wrong thing. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "You weren't looking for the wrong thing. You were looking for your sons, and God heard you." "He sent you," Caleb said simply. "Broken sent to broken. Grief sent to grief. Love sent to loss. And somehow, in all of that, he rebuilt everything." That night, after the boys were asleep, Caleb sat in his study and opened the journal Rebecca had kept during her pregnancy. He hadn't been able to read it before, but now he could. And on one of the last pages, she'd written something that made him understand even more. "If I don't survive this, I pray God sends someone to love them the way I would, someone who sees them, someone who stays, someone who knows that family isn't about perfection, it's about presence." Caleb closed the journal and looked toward the ceiling, toward heaven, toward the God he'd spent a year being angry at. "You heard her," he whispered, "and you answered. Thank you." Because in the end, he understood the truth that had eluded him through all the grief and rage and desperate searching. God sends healing through people. Love is louder than loss. Presence heals what power cannot. Family is chosen through staying. And grace, real grace, often wears an apron and gets on its hands and knees and loves broken things back to life. The mansion in Connecticut was no longer silent. It was home.